My husband struck gold with a $9 million lottery jackpot, but instead of celebrating, he filed for divorce and kicked me out. What he didn't realize was that he had overlooked the prenup his parents had insisted I sign before our wedding. I'm 35, and I come from a modest background. My parents live in a quiet suburb, and I grew up in a small 3-bedroom house that always smelled of fresh laundry and home-cooked meals. After high school, I took on a series of odd jobs, bartending, helping at my aunt's hardware store, and eventually managing a local sporting goods shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. My husband, on the other hand, came from a world I had never known. His parents owned multiple properties, drove luxury cars, and hosted extravagant parties several times a year. Let's call my father-in-law Raphael and my mother-in-law Mael. Mael was a tall, imposing figure, exuding a quiet dominance that filled any room she entered. Her casual remarks often felt like veiled threats, while Raphael had a knack for subtle disapproval. Just one raised eyebrow could make anyone shrink. They were never overtly cruel in front of me, but I could sense their disapproval lurking beneath the surface of polite conversation. After my husband and I got engaged, I quickly realized how much his parents feared outsiders encroaching on their family assets. They looked at me like an intruder, despite the fact that my husband and I had been dating for years. Before we could set a wedding date, Mael demanded I sign a prenuptial agreement. I didn't have the financial means to fight it legally, and I was too blinded by love to see the warning signs. I kept telling myself it was just a symbolic gesture to appease his parents. Love was all the guarantee I needed, right? The day I signed that document is etched in my memory. It was a warm afternoon at his parents' grand home. Marcus sat there as his mother laid out the prenup and slid a pen my way. Someone offered me coffee, as if this were a normal business transaction. My husband stood off to the side, saying little, and though it hurt, I shrugged it off, thinking it wouldn't matter in the long run. The contract stated that any gifts, inheritances, or trust funds belonging to his family would remain his separate property, while any major assets we acquired together, like a house or lottery winnings, would be considered marital property. I found that odd, but I just wanted to marry him. 6 months later, we tied the knot by a picturesque lake. My parents were overwhelmed by the extravagance but supportive. I remember the tension on my mother's face when she greeted my in-laws. She had always told me to trust my gut, but I thought love would conquer all doubts. The first couple of years passed without major incidents. We lived in a condo that his parents helped us secure. I paid monthly toward the mortgage, even though the down payment had come from Mael's gift. Looking back, it was never truly a gift, it was more like a tool for control. At the time, I assumed this was just how wealthy families operated. Our marriage had the usual money squabbles and occasional blowouts about our parents intruding on our decisions. They would show up unannounced, bringing new furniture or decor, and sometimes they would reorder our entire living space without warning. My husband would brush off my frustration, labeling it as his parents' helpful nature. Then came the day that turned everything upside down. My husband called me, breathless with excitement, to announce that he had won a $9 million lottery jackpot from a random ticket he bought at a gas station. At first, I was elated, dreaming of quitting our jobs and traveling the world, but that joy quickly faded. He insisted we keep it a secret, even from my parents. He became oddly paranoid, talking about claiming the money properly and meeting with lawyers I had never met. When I asked to join these meetings, he said I would feel out of place, which stung deeply. I had no idea the real bombshell was yet to come. One afternoon, I came home from work, exhausted, to find him there with his uncle, rummaging through drawers. He dropped the news casually. He was filing for divorce and told me to pack my bags and leave the condo, an arrangement he claimed was solely under his name. I was floored. Sure, I had contributed to the monthly mortgage payments, but apparently, he believed his mother's initial down payment and his newfound fortune made me irrelevant. My heart splintered as I called my mother, my voice shaking, telling her I had just been kicked out of my own home. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. But the biggest shock came next. I discovered that my mother-in-law had sent her personal attorney to shield him. Hearing that I was entitled to a substantial portion of the winnings felt like a lifeline. I had been so worried that the prenup would lock me out completely, but it turned out that my in-laws' fear of me claiming inherited wealth had overshadowed the possibility of a lottery scenario. My lawyer warned me that it wouldn't be easy. My in-laws were wealthy, well-connected, and likely to deploy an entire legal team against me. However, she believed we had a strong case, especially since I had contributed financially to the marriage and had been abruptly expelled from our jointly occupied home. I inquired about the divorce process in our state. A contested divorce could easily stretch for months or even longer, but if my husband's side realized they were on shaky ground, they might seek a fast settlement. My lawyer predicted they would try intimidation or underhanded tactics to get me to sign away my rights cheaply. Sure enough, within days, my mother-in-law left me a menacing voicemail, telling me to back off because I didn't deserve anything from her son. She claimed that if I pursued the lottery winnings, she would ensure I ended up with nothing. My lawyer advised me to document everything. Then, my father-in-law cornered me outside my parents' home, offering me a pittance if I would just vanish quietly. He presented it as a generous deal, but it was so low that it wouldn't even cover half the mortgage contributions I had made. I refused, stating that we would see each other in court. He scoffed, baffled by my defiance, clearly unaccustomed to anyone rejecting his money. With negotiations at a standstill, my lawyer filed motions to secure the lottery funds from being hidden or transferred. This enraged my in-laws, who began spinning tales about me being a gold digger who preyed on their innocent son. It stung, but I stood firm. My boss, who owned the sporting goods shop where I worked, had my back, brushing off my mother-in-law's attempts to meddle in my employment. Friends took sides, some called me petty, while others applauded me for fighting back. The tension was suffocating, but I refused to cave. After a couple of weeks of fruitless negotiation, we finally got a court date. My husband was nowhere to be found. He was practically under his parents' protective wings, ignoring all direct communication with me. He had his lawyers do the talking, claiming I was a leech who contributed nothing to the marriage. My lawyer pushed back with financial records, a timeline of bills, and the explicit prenup clause about windfalls. We also highlighted how I had been violently shut out of the condo. The judge ordered both sides to prepare for a more formal hearing on asset division. In one last attempt at intimidation, my mother-in-law threatened my boss again, who promptly told her to get lost. That only fueled my mother-in-law's anger. My lawyer said we needed to proceed carefully, but she was confident that a judge would see through their scare tactics. Nothing could have prepared me for the final showdown in court, but at least I knew the law was ironically on my side, thanks to the very prenup they had forced on me. Weeks passed, and the tension surrounding the upcoming hearing reached a fever pitch. My husband still avoided direct contact with me, yet his lawyers bombarded mine with motions, insisting that the lottery win was separate property because he had purchased the ticket. They ignored the prenup language that stated any major windfall during marriage would be considered marital. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law tried to smear my reputation among friends and business contacts, peddling the narrative that I was a gold digger who had married into the family solely for money. During this period, I felt a swirl of frustration and motivation. If they believed they could bully me out of my rights, they were mistaken. I had documents showing how I contributed to our shared life, utility bills, groceries, and partial mortgage payments. My attorney and I pored over every detail of the prenup. She pointed out a critical sentence specifying that all financial windfalls, including but not limited to lottery or game show winnings, shall be considered marital assets unless expressly designated otherwise. It was as if my in-laws had left the back door open without realizing it. A week before the hearing, we had a preliminary status conference. My husband arrived with his parents and a posse of lawyers, 4 attorneys plus a financial advisor. They looked at me with that same air of superiority, but their expressions faltered when my lawyer calmly produced the prenup text, highlighting the exact clause about lottery proceeds. The judge listened quietly, seeming unimpressed by their attempts to dismiss it, and ordered that all substantial assets remain frozen until the main hearing. That same afternoon, my father-in-law cornered me outside the courthouse, insisting we should talk like adults. He tried offering a lump sum even lower than before, labeling it generous for someone of my background. I was advised to keep my answers concise and let the evidence speak for itself. If they tried any emotional theatrics, we would counter with clear documentation. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the courthouse, my heart pounding. My parents accompanied me for moral support, though they waited outside the courtroom. Once proceedings began, I stepped in to see my husband seated beside his mother, both wearing stone-cold expressions. His father lingered at the back, arms folded. My mother-in-law's lawyers, dressed in polished suits, looked confident, perhaps believing that money and legal muscle could outmatch the facts. The judge, a stern man in his 50s, wasted no time. He invited each side to present their arguments. My husband's lead attorney tried to frame me as a minor contributor who had done little more than occupy the same living space. They argued that the lottery purchase was his personal transaction, done with his own money. But my lawyer calmly pointed out how the prenup explicitly lumped such windfalls into marital property. We also had bank records showing he had used our joint account card that day. When we introduced that evidence, I saw visible tension ripple through my mother-in-law's camp. The judge asked if they had any contrary documentation proving it was his personal funds. They fumbled, claiming the card was accidentally used or that it was his mother's deposit in the account. But the statements clearly labeled our names, not his alone. The judge took note, his gaze shifting to them expectantly. Finally, my husband spoke. He claimed he never wanted to hurt me, that his parents pushed for the divorce once the jackpot arrived to protect family assets. He stumbled over his words, admitting he felt pressured, but also tried to justify it by saying everyone would come after us if they knew about the money. My lawyer asked if he consulted me before making these decisions. He admitted no. The judge's disapproval became palpable. By midday, it was clear that the prenuptial agreement was a double-edged sword for them. The very document they had enforced to isolate their wealth now threatened to place a massive chunk of lottery winnings in my hands. The judge scheduled a subsequent hearing for final decisions, stating he was inclined to treat the lottery as a major marital asset subject to equitable distribution. Outside, my mother-in-law walked past me, muttering that this was far from over, but her confidence was definitely cracked. In the weeks leading up to the final ruling, their desperation escalated. My mother-in-law's lawyers tried everything, filing motions to reconsider the prenup's wording, claiming the intent hadn't been to include lottery proceeds. The judge denied these motions, pointing to the plain language. My father-in-law tried cornering me again, warning me I'd regret it if I broke their family. I told him point-blank that they had started this by kicking me out and blindsiding me with divorce. My husband tried reaching out, leaving emotional voicemails saying he didn't want things to end so bitterly, that if we could just come to a private arrangement, we could still salvage some relationship. I might have considered it if they had treated me fairly from the start, but after the intimidation, the lies, and the forced eviction, my trust was gone. My lawyer advised me not to engage in these back-channel talks. We had a strong legal position and no reason to settle for crumbs. Finally, the day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed with attorneys for both sides. My parents, along with a few friends, came to support me, seated quietly in the back. The judge took the bench, reviewed the updated filings, and allowed final statements. My mother-in-law's lead lawyer tried one last gamble, painting me as a cunning opportunist who only discovered the prenup's loophole after benefiting from the family's generosity. My lawyer countered with the straightforward facts. 1. They forced me to sign a prenup. 2. It explicitly included lottery or any windfall as shared property. And 3. My mother-in-law financed part of our condo, yet I contributed monthly, so it wasn't a purely separate asset either. Moreover, the swift divorce filing right after the jackpot was textbook evidence of their plan to isolate me from the winnings. The judge listened patiently, then delivered his ruling. He declared that the lottery winnings clearly fell under marital assets according to the prenup's language. He criticized my in-laws for trying to twist the agreement they themselves had drafted. He also found that my husband's immediate eviction of me from the condo was unreasonable and that I was entitled to reimbursement for my portion of the mortgage and other marital contributions. In summary, the judge set forth a clear order: I would receive a substantial percentage of the lottery payout, plus reimbursement for my share in the condo. We parted ways with a finalization date set a few weeks later just to process the paperwork. My mother-in-law's face was thunderous, and my father-in-law looked outraged. The judge's ruling was firm, and as it stood, we had no incentive to reduce it. The only concession I made was giving up all interest in the condo. I never wanted to set foot in that place again. They cut me a check for an impressive sum. Was it half the jackpot? Not exactly, but it was substantial enough to allow me to rebuild my life comfortably. Throughout it all, I realized that my in-laws, in their arrogance, believed wealth insulated them from consequences. They didn't expect me to fight back. Ironically, the prenuptial agreement they insisted on became the very instrument that secured my share of the winnings. Poetic justice, if ever there was. As far as I know, my husband remains under his parents' wing. He has lost face in his social circle due to the fiasco that erupted. Some mutual acquaintances told me he's struggling with guilt, but I doubt he'll ever openly admit his family's role in orchestrating this mess. I used part of the settlement to help my parents upgrade their home, as a gesture of gratitude for standing by me. Another portion I invested. Though the entire ordeal left me scarred, changing how I view trust, marriage, and money, I take comfort in knowing I stood my ground. I refused to be bullied into accepting table scraps. While it was excruciatingly painful, the final outcome felt like a triumph over tyranny. Now free from my in-laws' manipulative grasp, I'm moving forward. I've returned to a simpler life, ironically reminiscent of my pre-marriage days, but I'm stronger, wiser, and not at all the naive woman they assumed they could steamroll. If they recall anything about me, let it be that they inadvertently gave me the legal weapon to ensure I wasn't left penniless. They started the war, I finished it. That was the end of that chapter, but life, as it turns out, had more surprises in store. 6 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected email from Marcus's younger sister, Lily. Unlike the rest of her family, she had always been kind to me, though she kept her distance during the divorce to avoid her mother's wrath. She wanted to meet for coffee, saying there were things I should know. We met at a quiet cafe across town, far from her family's usual haunts. Lily looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder as if expecting her mother to materialize at any moment. Then she dropped a bombshell: my mother-in-law had orchestrated everything from the start. She had hired private investigators to follow Marcus to that gas station. Lily revealed, her hands trembling around her coffee cup, that she knew he bought lottery tickets there every Wednesday. When he won, their mother didn't just encourage the divorce, she threatened to cut him off completely if he didn't comply. The revelation hit me like a truck. My husband, who I thought had chosen money over love, had been manipulated just as much as I had been. Lily showed me text messages between her and Marcus from those early days after the win, him crying, confused, torn between his mother's demands and his feelings for me. He wanted to tell me everything, Lily continued, but their mother convinced him I would take everything if I knew the truth. She made him believe I would leave him anyway once I got rich. I sat there processing this new information. Part of me wanted to reach out to Marcus to tell him I understood now, but another part remembered how he had stood silent while I was thrown out of our home, how he had let his lawyers paint me as a gold digger in court. A week later, I received another surprising message, this time from my former mother-in-law herself. She wanted to meet. Against my lawyer's advice, I agreed, choosing a public restaurant where I'd have witnesses if needed. She looked older than I remembered, the strain of recent months evident on her face. To my shock, she didn't come to threaten or manipulate. Instead, she did something I never expected: she apologized. I was wrong, she said, her voice lacking its usual imperial tone. I was so focused on protecting our family's wealth that I destroyed my son's happiness. He hasn't spoken to me in months. He's in therapy now, dealing with the guilt and manipulation. I lost more than money in this fight. I listened silently as she continued. The lottery win had exposed the rot in their family dynamics, she admitted, her control over her children, her husband's enabling behavior, the toxic mix of wealth and power that had corrupted their relationships. Marcus asked me to give you this, she said, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter from my ex-husband, pouring out years of apologies, explanations, and regrets. I took the letter home but didn't open it for days. When I finally did, I found myself crying over his words. He didn't ask.